Hello and welcome. The Purdue Institute for the Study of the Iranian World welcomes you to another episode of our podcast, Legacies of Ancient Persia. Join us as we further explore the many legacies of ancient Persia and its relevance to global patrimony. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 3 of Legacies of Ancient Persia. I want to quickly provide everyone with a little update on a big change ahead of this forthcoming season of the podcast. We have had to adjust our release schedule to a once-a-month Thursday release. So unfortunately, you will have to wait a week longer for new episodes, but we did this to accommodate my new schedule. While I will continue to host the show throughout this academic year, this past summer, I left my full-time position at UCLA to pursue my PhD at the University of Bristol in the UK. So I hope you'll bear with us as I try to produce this show while also being a full-time PhD researcher. Now, with that out of the way, I am very pleased to announce that this week's guest is Dr. Margaret Root, a professor emerita of Iranian Studies at the University of Michigan. In this episode, we discussed her academic journey from classical and Near Eastern archaeology to Persian studies, highlighting key influences and interests in representational iconography, how Persian art differs from other ancient cultures, notably through its depictions of peace and cooperation rather than war, and the unique aspects of seals as both functional and artistic objects. We hope you'll enjoy this new season, and if you like our content, please let us know by giving our show a 5-star rating and reviewing us on Apple or Spotify. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. It is a nice, not very sunny, kind of cloudy morning here in Los Angeles, but I am really looking forward to getting into this conversation with you, and I want to start out and just ask you how you got into the field.
Well, I started out after a generalist BA degree in classical and Near Eastern archaeology at Bryn Mawr. I took an MA in Etruscan archaeology, and that's relevant because I see it as the beginning of what turned the corner for me into Achaemenid Persian studies. And that is to say that my interest in the Etruscans stemmed from my desire to look at a culture that had been positioned as inferior to Greek culture and kind of a stepchild, if you will. And I married that interest in the sort of other and the downtrodden to an interest in representational iconography. So those things coalesced in my MA degree. And then a new professor came to Bryn Mawr at that point, and his name was Carl Nylander, and he, at that point, was an up-and-coming specialist in the archaeology and art of Persia, that is to say, Fars, in southwestern Iran. And Carl enticed me into the study of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and I wrote my PhD under his supervision. And the PhD was published as a book, was a kind of grand exploration of the art of the Persian Empire as an exercise in empire building and in a completely new way, where we see an empire that was huge, as all the listeners will know by now, stretching from the Indus across all of Western Asia to the Mediterranean and across North Africa. So huge empire. How was it held together? What were the forces that enabled the empire to exist in the first place and to subsist across almost 200 years? It was unprecedented and really extraordinary when you think about it. So anyway, the structure of my dissertation used representational arts like the sculptures of Persepolis, other arts from other regions of the empire, to show how the Achaemenid experience of empire was creating something completely new, unprecedented compared to all the more ancient imperial art represented traditions like the great Assyrians and the Egyptians, who, both of whose cultures were extraordinarily rich in representational art, but always featuring the humiliation of the downtrodden enemy and this sort of thing. Whereas the Persian experience turned that upside down and created this artistic tradition that emphasized the cooperative, willing participation of all the lands and peoples of the empire. Now, this can be seen as just a very clever ploy in imperial creation where you flip things around in order to slyly give the same message of power. But I think it was something much more than that, much deeper than that. So basically, from those beginnings, I would say that in various ways, I'm still exploring this question, how this came about, what it means that an empire, an Iranian empire, no less, an evil empire, therefore, in the Western ways of viewing things, how this empire could have come to this way of viewing itself and being constructed throughout all these parts of its empire as a peaceful place.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. I picked up a minor in art history and archaeology.
Huh?
And so it felt just dipping my toe at the shallow end of the pool. And I was sad I didn't get to take more classes. And unfortunately, where I did my undergrad, we really didn't have anyone who could do Persian or any kind of Near Eastern art. I mean, I thought it was unfortunately just a symptom of the times we live in, but I was kind of comical. We had an expert in like Greek votive statues from Corinth
Huh?
teaching the class on Egyptian and Near Eastern art. And I said, oh, clearly, I mean, she can do it, obviously. Most good professors, they do the research and they're great. But I thought it was just very funny that when I talk about that class loving it, people say, oh, great. And who is the professor? And I go, yeah, well, Greek person. So, yeah, yeah.
Well, one of the things I'm really pleased about now as a retired person looking back on, 40 plus 50, almost 50 years of teaching, as you say, I had my specialty, but I taught a lot of courses, Lexi, that were on completely different topics. But one of the great things in my program at Michigan was that people did take my courses and seminars, and often they were seduced into Achaemenid studies through them and, didn't come to Michigan to become a Achaemenid specialist with me. Really, rather few people were in that category, but they saw in the Achaemenid Persian studies either ways or methodological insights that could help them in their work on the Roman Empire, maybe something like that, or were completely seduced into becoming Persian specialists. And because the material is so rich, it's so understudied, and so many interesting questions, methodological and also empirical, and so much opportunity in empirical research that really needs to be done and field research that needs to be done across the empire. So it's been really gratifying, even though while you do the math, I have never been able to take a student of mine to Persepolis, much less a class, to Persepolis, of course, to do some field training there, to look at the site and study it, because I started teaching in 1978, and that was a big year in Iran. And it just what didn't work out that I could ever take American students there.
It's such a tragedy. And I'm like, you
Yeah.
just missed it. Just missed it. Oh, I would have been so sad. Well, I mean, I don't know if there's light at the end of that particular tunnel of being back yet, but I think we'll just remain hopeful that like one day it will be because it's so sad. I mean, for anyone who wants to study any facet of, Persian history, it's sad, but especially I think it's so important, especially when you do art history, and it's so important to go out and into the field and see the sites and be able to show people things in situ and you get an idea of scale. It's super
Yeah.
important.
Yeah, it's just, you're so right. And I have numerous times been able to take tours to Iran. I don't do it anymore. It's too exhausting for me now, but I, from the Smithsonian Institution and then later on behalf of the Archaeological Institute of America. And these are very expensive tours that tend to preclude student participation. I brought two grad students of mine the last time I did it, but we had to do a huge fundraising effort to bring them along. I mean, I don't know, in those days, more than $10,000 per person for those things. And you stay in really nice hotels instead of the ones that a grad student would normally stay in. But so there have been opportunities to go back on that type of occasion, which was really splendid, but not with a class. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, one day. But yeah, I want to seize on a couple of things that you introduced when telling us about your research, and also that it does come into play when thinking about sites and being able to go see things. I'm really intrigued by this idea of art, representing a culture. I mean, it's just so interesting because I think, or what I should say rather, when I think of Persian art and the Persian conceptions of sort of the ordered universe and how things go, it's very different from how other places obviously have their art. And so just to kind of set a basis maybe for people who really know that much, and I've found that, a lot of people kind of confuse Mesopotamian with Persian art because they kind of go, oh, well, same kind of general place in the world, right? So it's all got to be pretty same. And I go, well, no, because Assyrian art looks, like this, and Persian art doesn't really do that many, lion hunts and battle scenes. And so just to kind of set a basis for this going forward in this conversation, when we talk about Persian art that you're looking at, and for kind of setting this basis of how they represent themselves in their culture, what are some staples that you can pull out and say, this is what makes it Persian, and these are the things that we see to clearly sort of define what we're looking at?
Well, first of all, when we right now are talking about Persian art, we're speaking about official art of the empire that was designed at really the highest levels. And we'll get to this, but we're not right now speaking about the art of you and me who happened to live it during the Persian Empire. And the intentionality of this Persian art does indeed look really different from what came before it. It draws heavily on the symbolisms of earlier traditions of Mesopotamia, like the Assyrian Empire that preceded the Persian Empire, and the most recent Egyptian imperial period. But as I was saying, it turns the symbolic messaging and stylistic components upside down, really, to create a message of peace and harmony. So, whereas an Assyrian king, if you go to the British Museum, you'll see, would emphasize these gory battle scenes, beheadings, and all the rest of it. And people are enthralled by that when they go to the Assyrian room at the British Museum. It's amazing artwork and its detail and so on, but it's all war. And coming right out of that tradition, something different has happened with these Persians, where instead of battle scenes, they showed scenes where the king is receiving gifts from the subject peoples. And these are symbolic gifts. They're not the kind of gifts that make the empire really run, like truckloads of wheat to feed flocks or something. These are symbolic gifts, like a few vessels of finely wrought metal or something like that. But anyway, so the message of the Persian Empire is all about this pacific notion of people coming together, literally and metaphorically, to participate in the work that the king is doing. And I think it probably has to do with some infusion of impulses brought by the Persians, the ethnic Persians themselves. They had not that many years before the empire was formed, moved as a peoples westward, sorry, from they're Indo-European speaking peoples, these Persians, and come from the east and moved into southwestern Iran gradually and brought new ideas with them. And it's got to be that in some sense, these new ideas included a different way of thinking about how power can work and can work most successfully what that means and is a bit elusive to me. I don't want to get too smarmy about it, and oh, all was beautiful and peaceful in this world, because of course there were terrible wars being fought on both sides frequently in the building of this big empire, but it wasn't at all the way the Greek sources, the literary sources, describe it, where the Persians, had blood dripping out of their mouths as they gobbled up Westerners and forged their empire. It was a very different view of how the world works than we'd ever seen before in their representational art. And the really what's fascinating is that work that's being done by me and esteemed colleagues, whom I'll name in a second, but on documents of the Persian Empire are showing repeatedly in different ways how this vast empire was populated by all different kinds of people who were in conversation with each other, real conversation, not through symbolic representations on stone walls of palaces. But there seems to have been a great deal of harmonious coexistence that enabled travelers from one end of the empire to another to go on their way on royal business or on their own business. They spoke a common language because you needed to be able to speak. It was called Aramaic, which was used to facilitate communication across this huge expanse. And this isn't just a sort of fantasy story. This is documented through source material in terms of texts that were excavated at the site of Persepolis and are now being read by specialist scholars to prove abundantly that this was going on in real time, in real life. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Oh man. No, that's so cool. I mean, I love hearing you talk about it and describe it. I mean, the excitement definitely comes through. And as you were talking, it flashed me back to when I was in college, and I'd be sitting in like an art history class, listening to my professor very intently, of course, in the first row. And I would think about art in a completely different way. And I remember it was such a great experience because I had a wonderful professor, and she said something where she likened artistic representations as a form of world building, right? Not just empire building, but world building.
Yeah.
And as someone who I play a lot of video games, and so world building is something that's incredibly important to that as well. And so then being able to almost think of it in that way was an incredible way to open up my mind. And so I'm thinking about, yes, so the official records and the most beautiful things that we have from these grand palaces, of course, they exist to tell a story, but they're very official, as you mentioned. And, that's lovely and wonderful. But as you sort of alluded to, yeah, that's not the art of you and me, so to speak. And there's a whole lot of people who are not royalty in this vast expanse. And so, when I'm thinking about how we're using art as world building for this place, how does it differ from these official sort of palace art pieces that come out and these commissioned works? And, so if I was to take my time machine, right, go and into the past and then sort of walk through just a random place in a Achaemenid Persia, what am I likely to find? And what kind of art, what story is this normal art trying to tell us about how these people lived and how they thought about the world?
Well, that's a great question. Two things come to mind on the level of monumental traditions, that is to say life-size sculptures or monuments like tombs. So I'm thinking about what modern Western Turkey, where there are tombs built, stone built tombs like fancy looking houses. Again, go to the British Museum, but where the sculptural reliefs that decorate the exteriors of these buildings may quote the sculptures of the kings at Persepolis, specifically the enthroned figure receiving presentations from underlings, what have you. But the artistic language of these decorated tombs in the Western Empire of elite personages. These are tombs of elite personages in the Western Empire. Okay. They are the artistic language, what they actually look like stylistically, is very Western, very sort of Greek-ish looking, even though the elite personage enthroned may be wearing a Persian-ish looking garment. But he doesn't really look Persian. He just looks like he's at a dress-up party, and but these people were certainly living in a way that was emulating Persian court customs of elite people, but also blending in their own social customs as well, how they dress and so on. But so the enthroned personage in the western end of the empire might be sitting under an umbrella. And this is a very Persian situation that you find in Persepolis of, and it denotes elitism of the king being able to walk slowly under a sunshade with servants holding for him and everything. But so the different parts of the empire and different stylistic languages will convey this blending of customs and privilege. And another example is from Egypt, a freestanding sculpture of one particular individual of Egyptian origin who is it's like an autobiographical sculpture. It's inscribed and it declares this man as a figure of the Persian Empire who's Egyptian by blood and by custom. But in order to fit in and do his work as a kind of persona of the Persian Empire now that Egypt has been conquered, he dresses in the Persian mode of a long gown draped with long sleeves and certain other accoutrements and that are clearly Achaemenid Persian. But he's an Egyptian guy and he's speaking the Egyptian language and everything else. And he's operating out of Egypt. But he's become a worker of the court in this far-flung part of the empire. And doubtless there were other figures that we just don't know about, except in our imaginations from, the Indus Valley and points in between in Central Asia and across Western Asia. We just happen to have this wonderful Persianate sculpture from Egypt that really says a huge amount about what it was like to, make your peace with being conquered and fit in, do your job, wear a
Wow.
dress.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And it's great that we still have these kinds of examples so we can kind of see both, what was happening within Persia by Persians, but also by people who definitely were on the periphery, were from places, and seeing how Persia affected them. It's really cool to see that. Again, just so much art, though, is produced professionally by people. I'm just out of curiosity. Do we have like small art pieces that remain from kids that tells us something about, you know, I don't want to say like rudimentary, but again, like the beautiful things that we see in museums most of the time. So, yeah, do we have anything from?
Yeah. Gosh, I'm not thinking of anything specifically by children, although there may be material that's lurking in the assemblages from excavated sites that haven't been identified that way and therefore haven't been cataloged that way, either in the publications or in the museum databases of the stuff. And the only sort of adjacent material that I can think of is what we have from studying seals that have been used to ratify clay documents of the Persian Empire that were excavated at Persepolis. And this is a big topic, and I don't want to preempt other questions by getting into it prematurely. But these clay tablets, the ones I'm speaking of, are thousands of literally clay tablets that can fit. They're so small, they can fit in the palm of your hand, Lexi. And they were discovered accidentally in the ruins of the fortification wall of Persepolis that rings the hill that stands at the back of the site of Persepolis. And they were discovered when Ernst Herzfeld, who was working at Persepolis in theory to sort of tidy up the site, he used a bulldozer to plow through this area of the site that turned out to be part of the fortification wall of the ancient Achaemenid fortification wall of Persepolis, where in fact the fortifications were casemate structures that had offices in them. It wasn't just a brick wall with nothing going on inside. It was, you know, a wall that contained literal office spaces in two floors. And so these clay tablets had been deposited in there probably for archival storage purposes. Then there was a great conflagration, apparently by Alexander the Great, that burned the whole place and including fired these tablets, which means that the clay, which hadn't been fired in a kiln, got fired by this great conflagration that Alexander caused, which is really cool because that means that they were preserved forever. Because once you fire clay, you can't get rid of it. It's just there, hard as stone. So these tablets, these small tablets, are called the Persepolis fortification tablets because they were found by accident in the fortification walls of Persepolis. And they turn out to be like the life work of me, as well as my first PhD student and now absolutely wonderful collaborator, Mark Garrison. We study the seals that were impressed on these tablets. And the tablets, the texts on the tablets were written in Elamite, the ones we study, and many of them were read and translated by Richard Halleck, who published a wonderful volume of English translations in 1969. There are thousands of these documents, thousands of them. And we are working on, in our specific project, on the seals that ratify a little over 2,000 of the tablet texts. And many thousands of seals are used on these little documents, often multiple times. And they're really hard to study because often the seal impressions are very vestigial and you have to pore over them in order to eke out an image. But the really exciting thing is that these seals that were applied to the tablets include official seals of the highest, most prestigious orders of the empire. And they also include seals like a very often occurring seal of a guy who traveled back and forth leading parties of men, mostly, across the empire. I would describe him as a fixer primarily. He was the leader. He was the one who procured food for the people and for the animals under his charge. And he could do all sorts of things. And so we have the image that he chose to represent himself in all his dealings on behalf of his work, crisscrossing the empire on behalf of the work of the empire. And the most important part of it is that it's such a big dossier of representational information linked to individuals and what they were doing on day one, and then day two and day five, and where they were when they did that work. Then for some reason, these tablets got bundled up and brought back to home base at Persepolis. There must have been a lot of work that went on in Persepolis that would seem a little bit boring to us on the face of it, but was real empire work that these busy bureaucrats, tabulating who went where, how much he got paid, and so on and so forth. There were some royal women who were involved in the transports too, and very interesting stuff about them and what their representations on their seals might tell us about the female condition in the elite sectors of the empire. But the really, downtrodden people, or really invisible people like children or handmaidens who weren't of some prestige, not so much. We don't. There are still invisible cohorts, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure this happens a lot. It's hard to track. Some things don't make it. So,
Yeah.
yeah, totally
Yeah.
understandable. But I'm glad that you mentioned the seals and stuff because I was hoping to get into that.
Oh,
Um,
good.
but to set the stage a little bit as well. Again, when we're talking about art, yes, we like to think of the big show pieces that you look at and you go, oh, that's so interesting. But art obviously is not restricted to that. Art can be down to usable objects that are, yes, works of art, but also usable objects. And I really think that seals hit this category because we
Yeah.
you use them, but also they are beautiful and they can art. And I'm just kind of curious, the seals are the obvious ones because you've been mentioning it, and we're going to get into that. But, just for the purpose of giving us a wider sampling, let's call it, what are some other things that we have that are both art, but like objects that we would consider, usable for a purpose rather than just being, a tchotchke, essentially?
I'm certain that, well, things like bowls that could be used for functional purposes, eating out of or making food in, are definitely one key element. They could be prized in the Persian court. You see on the wall reliefs of the Apadana at Persepolis various gift-giving delegations from around the empire holding uplifted in their hands bowls. You can't tell from the pictures whether they were meant to be gold and silver or clay. Although one former PhD of mine, Alex Noggle, who does a lot of work with color on the sculptures of Persepolis, and he's found vestiges of color that might suggest that these bowls were indeed meant to represent metal, because like a light color is often used to indicate silver, for instance. But leaving that aside, just the representation of the bowls as bowls, whether of clay or of precious metal or bronze, were a high-end gift, and they seem to have symbolized the working tradition of eating as a practice that brought people together, as well as the craft tradition of making a beautifully turned or beaten vessel. I mean, a vessel can be beautiful, made out of clay, and these are very elegant, simple shapes. And it's interesting that vessels brought to the king on the walls of Persepolis in sculptures do not depict the fanciest kinds of vessels that existed in the Persian court. They depict these bowls that were a rather simple shape. And it's been posited that, in fact, it was the very commonality of these bowls that have been found at sites across the empire that indicate, one, this practice of dining that had become very particularized in the Persian court. In other words, their menu expectations had changed and become a court production that necessitated the use of these bowls, because that's, you were using bowls to eat on, not plates or whatever. But also that they were items of prestige that you would give as gifts that denoted your buy-in to the practices of dining and banqueting, court etiquette. So there are these layers of what an object could be, even in a rather simple form, that requires some imagination on the part of the people who study these things. Not I, but people who want to ask questions. Why were these bowls so important? What does it mean? Does it have to mean the Persians didn't have anything better to do than make boring, same old bowls? Or could it mean something much more important and interesting than that?
I mean, we can't all make the beautiful bullheaded raita and just drink out of
That's
them all the
right.
time, as
That's
fun as it would
right.
be.
And those are for a very specific, particular kind of dining also. So when you getting back to this notion of where we might find objects made for or by children in some of the assemblages of, like, cemeteries of the Persian Empire, that there's one well-known one in the scholarly literature at Devehuyuk in modern Turkey that was published by Roger Mori. And there's still a lot to look at in that assemblage and ask new questions, because the stuff is well preserved and it has been published. God bless Roger Mori,
Yeah.
as we're all aware, not everything that's excavated gets published. So this is wonderful. And there might be something there.
Yeah.
But the seals that I'm working on along with Mark Garrison, the fortification tablet seals, often include images that are childlike and or playful or very simple in their stylistic values that look as if they might have been made or designed by a child in that sense. But I don't have any evidence at all to suggest that they were indeed, but rather it seems as if there was a workshop in Persepolis, right in the region of Persepolis that encompassed the royal site itself, where seals were being cranked out at quite a pace to serve the numbers of people who were coming into this area to work for the court and who needed seals. Some people had more than one seal anyway. And these seals that were being cranked out at a high rate, I think were often ready made and were purchased by people who then would often probably pay extra to have something added to the imagery. Because, of course, a seal is carved in the negative into the stone, and you can add things to the image once it's already been carved. As long as there's a little bit of space, you can add something extra. And often these pret-a-porter seals, ready to take away seals, had lots of blank space available, probably on purpose. And sometimes on the tablets that we're studying, they've been left that way. And sometimes imagery has been very clearly added after the fact to suit the interests of the specific person whom we document doing work for the empire on the tablet texts. In other words, we can see this guy, we know this guy's name, we know what he added to his seal to make it really speak, might be his name as well as some imagery. And so these people become very alive through that, and their art might seem simplistic compared to the very elite, complicated representations of courtly seals of the same environment. But the people who owned these seals clearly were very proud of them. And we even have evidence, Lexi, of people playing with their seals. Like, they would wear their seals maybe hanging from around their neck or on a wristband or a pin, so that they were visible on the person as a kind of jewelry and could be taken off and passed around to show off. They were often made of beautiful stones. So the stones themselves had a kind of value and beauty. And on some of these little tablets, you can see like two people with their individual seals, and we know what the seal looks like because we traced it and everything, fooling around, like one guy rolling out a cylinder seal on the clay while it's still sort of damp so that it takes an impression. And then the other guy who's making a transaction with him will take his seal and place it in a very clever, sly way so that it creates a different picture, because it like partially overlays an animal on the first seal and makes a different looking animal out of that original animal that was implanted on the damp clay. And these are very intentional moves that are being made, and often kind of funny, silly moves, which just pop out and say, oh, wow, this guy who just seemed to be the most boring pencil pusher in the empire, just signing off all these requisitions for, 10 liters of beer to go to Queen so and so. And okay, so that proves that the Queen drank beer. All right. Well, that's really exciting, but where do we go from here? But in fact, the idea that these pencil pushers of the empire were human beings with their own senses of humor. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think again of how most of us were trained to think of the Persian Empire and its dwellers as these sort of bloodthirsty maniacs, who were browbeaten into mass murder and just had no culture and certainly wouldn't have had any sense of humor or any ability to have humor sanctioned as okay to display on basically a public document,
Wow.
because these tablets didn't get put in your pocket and out of sight. They were picked up and carried back to home base for review. So they were very public.
Wow.
So,
That's,
these are
yeah.
real people.
That's so cool. I mean, okay, well, I mean, you've talked about them some, but now for the rest of the audience who I want to bring along with us, because this is
Yeah.
so interesting to hear. If I remember correctly, at Michigan, you had a pretty expansive collection of seals and other admin documents, I believe. And it's very funny because when I still talk to people who are just curious and they say things like, oh, what schools should I go to? What should I look at? Who has the resources? What if I like the Persians? What if I like the Greeks, but I want to do interdisciplinary research with Persia? I don't tend to think of Michigan for some reason as a powerhouse, as a place that produces people who study Persian history, but I know it is. And so I'm sure a large part of this is because you brought some seals. And so I would love if you could just tell our audience a bit about the seals and the projects that you had there at Michigan.
Well, first of all, yeah, I've been retired for about 15 years, but I was really fortunate to get this job at Michigan because it it did enable me to create for the time I was working there a kind of base for the study of the Persian Empire that was very lively in its day. And the students I mean, it was a requirement of the program, to pass tests in Greek and Latin. So it was very classicist based and Greek and Roman history. But after that, they could do whatever they wanted within the parameters of what was on offer university wide in art history and archaeology and anthropology and so on. So we had a very diverse group of students who would come and maybe study with me and get enticed into taking degrees that emphasize the Persian Empire. But the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology, where I had a joint appointment, does not it has a very interesting collection of seal artifacts and some sealed tablets, but they're not from Persepolis. They were collected at the turn of the 19th century, mostly by an Orientalist called Leroy Waterman, and but they don't have anything to do with Persepolis, strictly speaking. For a while, the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, as it was then called, excavated Persepolis in the 1930s, and at that time, all these tablets were brought back from Persepolis to Chicago on terms of a study loan, as it was called, with the implication that once the studying had been done, they would be returned to Iran. Well, when I started working on the seals impressed on the tablets, for a little while, I had a loan from the Oriental Institute to Ann Arbor, Michigan, of a small collection, a small selection of the tablets, the Persepolis fortification tablets. And they resided in my museum in Ann Arbor on loan from the OI. And it was at that point that my first PhD student, Mark Garrison, started looking at them and becoming really engaged with them. And then after I had to send them back to Chicago, he continued working on them in Chicago, which isn't all that far away. But eventually, all these tablets, many thousands of tablets, had to be returned from the Oriental Institute to Iran, and rightly so. They'd been kept since 1933, 34, and they were due back. And part of our project documented them in black and white photographs as much as we could manage. And now subsequent projects have documented them in much more high end, you know, 360-degree photography, digital photography. Our stuff from back in the early 80s was all, black and white still photographs. It's very primitive in comparison. But anyway, so that the tablets were basically, for the most part, in Chicago for all those many years. And I've forgotten where I was supposed to go with that. Help me out here.
Yeah, no, I mean, there wasn't supposed to be a specific way other than, yeah, just tell us how you got the collection there. And because, again, people just don't think of Michigan as a place
Yeah.
or at least I don't, where you could have gone.
No.
It produces people who do Persia, which is awesome.
Yeah, it did for a while, and it was great. I was able to, at the Kelsey Museum, to create exhibitions sometimes that focused on issues of the Persian Empire and bring in loans. Of course, that's one great function of a museum, to have an apparatus that's staffed by people who are great at facilitating these things and know all the legal ins and outs of how to do international loans and everything like that. So I was really fortunate to work in a place where that sort of thing was possible as well. From my perspective, the tragic end of the story about all that, though, was that in the last years of my career, I was going to do my on site career. I was going to do an exhibition about the Persepolis fortification tablets. And it was going to be called Ancient Animations. And the vision of it was going to turn the exhibition space partly into like a video game parlor and have video games created using the visual and text information from the fortification tablets, from the seals and the texts, to draw on these individuals of the empire, what they were doing, the kind of trouble they got into, funny stuff, but all with an educational aim and populated by real data from the tablets and the seals. And it could be things like make your own seal, that kind of fun stuff. But a lot of it was going to be historically based storyboarding, very expensive to do, as I'm sure you're aware, to create video games. But we still have a school of art and design with these wonderfully talented students who do this all the time for MA projects and such. So there was talent to be drawn upon for, for the fun of it, for the kudos they got. And, so it was all possible. But a lot of people who had the final say didn't really believe in the notion of an exhibition that wasn't totally artifact based, literal material artifact based. And that is to say, the idea of using a lot of the exhibition space as experiential learning stations, punctuated by wonderful loans from Paris or London or whatever. It didn't meet with approval. And so I had to scrap the idea. And it still makes me very sad, because I think we could have pulled it off and it would have been really great. And then we could have sent it to Tehran. We could have sent it to Paris. It would have been eminently transportable as an exhibition with a USB drive. And so I think, although I was really lucky to have a job that had a museum component to it, a curatorial component to it, that last episode was the one where I felt the limitations of different perspectives on what a museum could be under certain circumstances, and limitations of what people who weren't right in the middle of the Persian Empire studies, as I was, that could find interesting. And I still struggle with that. I still don't often go to museums where I see that we've satisfactorily been able to create modes for articulating a big empire filled with real people. Someday, somebody else will do it.
Oh, I'm sure someone else will. I mean, as we're seeing,
Yeah.
just, well, there's a boom in video games. There's a boom in using video games in museums. There's a lot of up and coming projects. So I think that hopefully somebody will come and pick up where you left off. But yeah, sad we didn't get that sooner, but I hope that someone does come. It was really cool.
Yeah. Well, talk it up, please.
I will. I'm gonna go, tell all my cool video game developer friends there's a project here. Just let's work with some scholars and we'll do it. Well, I hope it gets done. That would be really cool.
Yeah.
Well, there's so much more I could ask you, but I don't want to, impose on your time any further. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to pivot us.
Interested in learning more about the wonders of ancient Persia? Visit the UCLA Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran. The Gazetteer digitally preserves famous locations, World Heritage sites, and lesser-known areas from all time periods of ancient Iranian history. You can explore using the interactive map or visit the encyclopedic catalog for updates to the ever-growing list of archaeological sites. Visit www.irangazetteer.ucla.edu and learn more about what the Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran has to offer.
There are two questions I normally ask at the end of our podcast. And the first of these is, what, in your opinion, is the greatest legacy left to us from ancient Persia?
The presentation of a different way of viewing what an empire can be represented as, a different way that was unprecedented in the ancient world before the Persian Empire, and which, in my opinion, laid the foundation for emulation by the Greeks with the Parthenon frieze, and then with the Romans, and that with the monument called the Areopagus of the Emperor Augustus, where in each case, again, empire was viewed as a presentation of converging resources coming towards center in the service of a harmonious project of stable governance. And I think that there's a lot of pushback about the possible relationship of the Madonna reliefs of Persepolis and the Parthenon frieze. I've published about this and gotten very mixed reviews. There's definitely a lot of pushback by some classicists about the notion that there could be any kind of positive emulation of Persian traditions, but I haven't given up on the possibility that more entrenched classicists may come around, even as more wide thinking, broad thinking people are definitely open to talking about it with their students in class and so on, just thinking about its possibilities. But so that's a big thing that I hope will keep going forward.
Yeah. Okay. That's awesome. And the second question I really have for you is, what do you think would be the best legacy that we as scholars currently can leave for future students of Iranian studies?
Well, this sounds corny probably, but that we are really only beginning to tap the resources available to us in terms of empirical data that are available to us through published works already, or that scholars are right now working to bring into accessibility through publication. And we touched upon this already in our conversation, that published site reports, for instance, often probably need to be mined again with some of these really interesting questions that haven't been asked about the Persian Empire. Well, what was uncovered at this cemetery that's of Persian date? And what might it say about children or women or understudied population groups, just for instance? And that we've got without even more excavations, we've got a huge amounts in museum storerooms around Western Asia and Europe, and Egypt, for instance, where there's a lot of stuff to be studied, slicing it in different ways, thinking about questions of the Persian Empire. And so there are excavations ongoing at Persepolis in southwest Iran, and that's really wonderful and important. But we have plenty to study, even if that weren't happening, plenty to study that's been excavated and needs new questions by creative people.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, there's no answer that's too corny, in my opinion. Everything is permissible here, especially since it's so up to interpretation and speculation. So I deem it okay. So that's
good.
That's good. So, man. Well, the final thing I'm really going to do is say, are there any publications, resources, anything that you would like to direct people to, either that you've worked on or you think would just be good? And I mean, if anyone, listens to this episode and says, oh, she's so cool, where do I find more of her stuff? Or, where can people do that?
Yeah, well, the most recent article of mine that just came out, I think it has a 2025 publication date, but maybe it's 2024. You know how these things can be, but it's in the in a journal called Ash Shark. It's ASH-SHARQ, volume 8, I think. It's edited by Laura Batista. And in that article, I do an iconographical study of imagery of the ibex, the mountain goat that had a very privileged position in the symbolism of ancient Iran and even in more modern Iran. And I explore the symbolism of this mountain goat on the seals of Persepolis that we've been talking about today. And it has very ancient roots in Iranian artistic representation. I mean, way back into, like 2000 BC, that sort of thing. But it got redeveloped in the Persian Empire in really interesting ways. And it's not a long article. I could send you the link, or I could send you a link. But and I try to write it so that it's not like just for people who study the seals on fortification tablets all the time, day in and day out,
Yeah.
The imagery is really beautiful and seems to speak a kind of religious, spiritual experience going on through these representations. And they're quite stunning representations, and they will show the ibex being like protected from danger. The ibex was, I could start talking forever, but the ibex was really important in antiquity and early and in medieval times, as for this stone that it produces in its gut can be used to save people from snake bite. And for that reason, it had sort of protected status in medieval times because of its curative powers. The animal had curative powers.
Mm-hmm.
So it needed to be protected and saved. And even if it was dead, it could be harvested. So the imagery constructs the complexity of this notion of the ibex as a sacred animal, a beautiful animal, and one with these extraordinary curative powers that must have remained sort of mystical. I mean, how does this work? But it is a medical fact that there are curative agents in these stones that build up accrete in the gut of a mountain goat. Anyway, who knew? But
yeah.
I mean, it's wonderful stuff. And clearly the Persians had, within their construction of religiosity and spirituality, they had this symbolism at the forefront and were eager to combine it with other symbols of the Achaemenid Persian court, of the winged disc, which seems to have symbolized the concept of Ahura Mazda, the great god, that you hear about in a lot of the royal texts of the Persian Empire. And so I will send you the link to that.
Yeah, please do. I'll include the link in the eventual show notes that I will be putting in. So that way anyone who is curious can click the link from there and they'll be taken right to anything we want to put really in there. So yeah.
Cool. That's great. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, with that though, I want to thank you for joining me on this podcast. I know scheduling is always hard and it's taken a while, but I was so happy that we were able to make something happen.
Yeah, me too. Thanks, Lexi, so much. Wonderful to meet you.
Yeah, you too. Legacies of Ancient Persia is a Portavood podcast production, hosted and edited by Lexi Henning, with select episodes co-hosted by Marissa Stevens. Cover art provided by Hadley Leesman and original music by Brent Arhart. Established in 2017 as the premier research center for the study of ancient Iran, the mission of the Portavood Institute for the Study of the Iranian World is to engage in transformative research on all aspects of Iranian antiquity, including its reception in the medieval and modern periods, by expanding on the traditional domains of old Iranian studies and promoting cross-cultural and interdisciplinary scholarship. Thanks for listening to our show. It's available to stream on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Portavood Institute and at Portavood UCLA, or visit our website portavood.ucla.edu. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and review us. For podcast inquiries or questions about the Portavood Institute, please email us at portavoodpodcastproduction@gmail.com. We'll see you next time as we continue our deep dive into the legacies of ancient Persia.